Welcome everyone to Chart Chat. We're excited to have folks joining us live from hopefully around the world. We always love if you choose to chime in and add where you're joining us from and say hello in the chat box below. So if you'd like to go ahead and join in and chat there and share where you're here from, we'd love to hear from you. I'm Amanda Makulec. I am a health data visualization designer based in Washington, D.C. I also serve as the executive director for the Data Visualization Society, and excited to be joined by my co-hosts today to chat through our chart chat for the day. Today, we're going to be talking about the tiny design decisions of data visualization. So thinking about the ways in which we make lots of small modifications or seemingly small modifications that make a big difference in terms of how we communicate information and visualize data. So I'm here with my three co-hosts today. I'm going to go down the panel of my wonderful co-hosts and let them introduce themselves. Andy, you're at the top. Want to go ahead and say hello?
I'm at the top. Hello, everybody. Andy Cotgreave, lead evangelist at Tableau, co-author of the Big Book of Dashboards, and coming to you from an extraordinarily hot Oxford, England.
Lovely.
Nice to see you all.
Steve.
Hey, I am Steve Wexler. I am the founder, principal, and now chief chart looker adder at Data Revelations. I am also one of three authors of the Big Book of Dashboards and the author of The Big Picture. And let me hand this over to Jeffrey.
Jeff Shaffer here from Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and VP of IT and Analytics at Unifund and adjunct professor at the University of Cincinnati, where I teach data visualization. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, excited to have everyone here today. Excited to have all of you joining us today from around the world. It's great to be able to see folks live and be able to connect with you and hear your questions. As you know, it's more than just chit chat. It is chart chat, and we are excited to dive into lots of nitty-gritty things about charts today. You are very encouraged to join the debates that we have in these chart chat conversations. It's why we host these sessions live instead of as recorded webinars. And we welcome to have you go ahead and add your insights, ideas, or your pushback. If you think there's a decision or something we're saying we would make that you would do differently, we love to hear those things too. If you want to go ahead and join in the conversation, if you're not familiar with using the YouTube chat on YouTube Live, feel free to go ahead and use the chat box that you'll see appearing to the panel if you're in a collapsed screen view off to the right-hand side. You also can pop out the chat with a little pop-out button that will allow you to go ahead and view the chat and your larger screen view together. So feel free to go ahead and chime in there. If you'd like to register and get yourself sorted for September, we do have our September date picked and planned. We'll be going live on September 8th. And so we hope you'll choose to join us for Chart Chat Live number 33. You can register at bigpic.me/cc33. And we'll add that link into the chat box as well. But we'd love to see you again. We will be taking a bit of a summer holiday in August, so no Chart Chat in August, but we hope you'll join us again in September. Today, our agenda is as follows. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the reasons why we picked this topic today, the things that influence our tiny design decisions, and what it is that we would like to go ahead and dig into today, why we ended up picking this topic. Then talk about those little design decisions in data visualizations, and each of my three co-hosts has some great examples teed up to go ahead and share ideas around how we think not only about what those decisions are, but how we gauge how much time we spend on them, which I think is really important. And then, as always, we'll try to close out with our lightning round. We'll talk about Boris Johnson's resignation and the chart with the y-axis that kept breaking, and to prototype on paper or not, and point back to an interesting conversation that sparked off on Twitter a little while back from Andy. As we go ahead and we go through today, we hope that you'll stick with us and go ahead and comment down in the chat about your thoughts on these different topics. And we hope that you will go ahead and stick with us for the after party that we always have afterwards, where we hop on a Zoom call and let folks go ahead and become part of the conversation, not just in chat, but actually being able to go off mute, on your mic, and go ahead and share your ideas. So as we think about what we were talking about today, we put some notes a few months back, actually. These are tweets from May from Danielle Alberti, and she is the lead of the data visualization and data journalism team at Axios. And she commented that one thing I notice a lot as a data viz journalist is that there's this tendency in the data viz world to act like there's one correct way to visualize any given data set, and that the rules are rigid and everything just needs to be shown. And this idea that we would evaluate primarily precision around how precise a data visualization is, or have other very objective measures for what a good data visualization looks like. And it's been an interesting conversation to reflect on for me, because we are currently preparing for hosting the Information is Beautiful Awards in the fall. And a big part of that is assessing how do you actually assess a good data visualization. And her follow-up point in her thread was that data viz is about informing your audience, and that her audience might be different than yours, and stories might be different, and there's lots of ways to approach a given data set. So we thought it was a really interesting point that oftentimes we talk about rules and frameworks and decision making in a way that implies there are certain paths that are better or worse than others, which there may be. But we also talk a lot about the fact that in data visualization, the questions about what makes a good chart and what is the right chart type or the right color, or the right encoding or the right text depends. It depends a lot on the audience. It depends on the story you're trying to tell and what you're trying to communicate. And so as I was thinking about the ways in which our perceptions of what a good data visualization looks like and the decisions have been shaped, I was thrown back to Elijah Meeks's presentation at Tapestry back in 2019 and his associated blog post. And he talked about 3 waves of data visualization, the first being around clarity. And this idea of creating much more decluttered, simplified graphics that allow you to communicate key information, often in static charts and graphs that are more explanatory in nature. And he gave examples from Edward Tufte, Stephen Few, Cole Nussbaumer-Naflick, and others talking about the ways in which we communicate that information. Then he talked about systems and how there are various different systems of thinking around how we make design decisions and what all of those different components of a chart or graph are, which allow us to think more meaningfully and have a shared language for talking about the ways in which we make different design decisions. And then he talked a lot about this third wave, this convergence of different fields within data visualization and around data visualization that looks beyond just the BI tools or dashboards or really austere, simple chart types and focuses more on the ways in which we bring in different kind of creative arts into our work. And if we think back to the ways in which we think about data visualization, I'm sure many folks have heard various different ways of opining on issues of chart junk and the clutter and other things that seem gratuitous on different charts and graphs. But it feels like we're having a bit of a resurgence or a wave where we're making a lot more deliberate decisions to add small embellishments or things that help people connect with our charts and graphs in interesting ways. And part of that happens because we're bringing people together from various different disciplines who have different backgrounds, ideas, and a lot of art and design skills that can really marry in those graphical elements that are really elegant and emotion provoking without actually being things that become chart junk. So we'll dive into some of those different conversations today. At I/O in May, Alberto Cairo kind of summed this up very nicely in some slides talking about themes from his upcoming book and talked about this broader pragmatic shift in visualization design, where it's not really about applying rules necessarily, but making justifiable choices according to different goals and constraints. And so as we talk today, we'll talk a lot about the ways in which we make decisions, but that doesn't mean that that's necessarily the same way that you might. So we'd welcome hearing from you in the chat. Steve, did you have some thoughts on Alberto's kind of reflections here? As we're going to be kicking off and talking about what this actually means in practice.
Yeah, and I'll share a couple of things in a minute, but I think Alberto is giving us all permission not to use a bar chart. Now realize the incredible gift of the bar chart that we've all been given. This thing that humans without any training can use to make accurate comparisons. I can show it to someone who's not studied data visualization at all and say, roughly, how much bigger is this than this? And they're probably going to get it. So, or you can use a dot position from a common baseline. But what an amazing gift you have in allowing this. But I think Alberto is saying there, if you have a good reason for not using that, okay. And I'm going to share a couple, few places where I think there's some pretty good reasons for not using this. And do you need to make an accurate comparison, or do you need people to feel something? And this was from a while back, a Makeover Monday exercise, maybe from 2017. If the world were 100 people, how might you envision this? This was the original visualization that led to Andy Kriebel, and I don't know who was curating it at the time. With Andy, it might have been Andy Cotgreave, it might have been Eva Murray. And gee, is this how you would visualize that data set? Well, here's how I visualized this data set. A boring plebeian bar chart. And but it does facilitate understanding. And maybe I want to look at something and go, hey, what does it mean for 1 out of 100 people to be starving? Now realize if I show this to people, nobody is going to open up their checkbooks based on this. But in the hands of someone like Athanasopoulos, wow, that's a really potent way to present the same data. And he has a good reason not to be presenting this in a bar chart. And I keep thinking over and over again how often I see how effective, at least to me, I don't know my 3 colleagues here and everybody else, if others feel the effectiveness of what I will call these lonely unit charts. It was used in the book that was just published 2 days ago, the Carbon Almanac. How much carbon are we talking about? And the difference between 300 parts per million and 500 parts per million is catastrophic, and a very effective way to do this with a unit chart. Or showing death rates from energy production and how much more accidents and problems there are associated with coal than with nuclear. In any case, I think these are good reasons. I don't need to make accurate comparisons. I need to get people to feel something here. And by the way, if you have not purchased it yet, please consider getting a copy of the Carbon Almanac. It will give you the confidence that you need to have intelligent conversations about all this stuff. So
and if you've not seen it, check out our last chart chat.
Yeah.
Indeed.
If you'd like to behind
here
the
you
scenes
go.
of how the Carbon Almanac was written by, I mean, what is it, 200, 300 people altogether?
Somewhere between 200 and 300 people volunteered to put this thing together in a very short amount of time. And it is, I think, worth your investment. Read it, talk about it, share.
Fantastic. So let's go ahead and dive into some of the ways in which we kind of think through and make these tiny design decisions. Andy, you had some thoughts, and I feel like we're all hearkening back to things that we've talked about for years and tried to make sense of when we were on workshops or trainings. And I think all we're reaching back and saying, wow, there are things that are quite evergreen about how we think about this topic.
Yeah, I'm about to go way back. Before I do, hello, everybody. Ray made a comment about he foresees Cotgreave's law coming up. I'm actually not going to talk about Cotgreave's law, but for those who haven't seen it, here it is. The longer a novel visualization exists, the probability that someone says it should have been a line chart will approach 1. Maybe I can elaborate on that in a different or a subsequent chart chat. We talked about it 2 years ago. Maybe we could revisit it on in fact, what happened during the pandemic, because there were plenty of examples there. But that's Cotgreave's law. But today I want to talk about design decisions, and not so much chart choice, but how we annotate and form and lay out our visualizations. Our goal as visualizers and chart makers is to implement a number of design improvements in order to improve user engagement. And by user engagement, I'm saying the sort of visceral positive response, but also the reducing the cognitive effort for them to get to the insight you want them to get to. You will reach a plateau. At some point, you will be implementing little design changes that stop making a difference. So the thing I've learned over many years is to kind of get a better idea of when the juice is or is not worth the squeeze. And I'm interested to hear in the comments whether you've had similar experiences too. As a quick recap, so let's go way back. Let's look at Andy's design history. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the first Tableau dashboard I ever built. This was 2007 at the University of Oxford. I was a data analyst studying students in the university, and this was amazing. Design-wise, slightly naive, perhaps. 3 years later, this was a viz that was featured in The Guardian on the data blog, showing how bikes zip around London, and maybe evolution of design, possibly not great steps forward. But by 2014, I was beginning to settle down on my own design style that I still kind of use today. This is from a project I was doing looking at all the tweets for the World Cup. And this was a fun one, looking at how many letters are in the word goal when people score goals in the World Cup or players, somebody scores goals. And then eventually that led to these two visits from 2014 and 2015, both of which won internal Tableau IronViz competitions. We called it the VizWiz competition. And as you can see by now, this was the style I was settling down on, which I kind of continue using today. It's quite austere. It's very plain, inspired by The Economist. never forget that there's always somebody who's starting their Tableau journey or data viz journey, whichever tool you use. And they like me when back in 2007, this was the best thing I'd ever built. So always be mindful of how we judge other people's work because we don't know where they are on their journey. But I want to focus on this one. As I said, this one, an internal competition. And I actually wrote a huge amount of blog posts, which I'll talk about, I'll mention in passing in a moment. It's data about fatalities on the roads in the US. So not a happy data set, but that's what we were given. And it's 3 panels. First one shows how fatalities trend January to December. Then there's a sort of dive into more detail looking at calendar days. Most fatalities happen on July the 4th and January the 1st. And then there's but you know what? At least fatalities are going down. Now, incidentally, since this, fatalities started going up again after 2014 and have continued to go up proportionally. So that trend has changed. But what I want to talk about now is these the design decisions that went to this dashboard. Before I get into the detail of that, I want to talk about the layout. There's a very specific choice that I made in this layout. We're all familiar with 3-panel comic strips. Here is my favorite Dilbert. Dilbert says the installation is successful. I have 128 KB per second of digital access to the internet. This is old. But then he does the victory dance, and then Dogbert just looks on in dismay. I love this because, in fact, let me know in the comments. Do you relate to this? Have you ever been a software engineer or done something engineering successfully and feel like doing a victory dance at your desk? Yes, I'm seeing smiles from my co-hosts. I have definitely done this. Right.
Let's go on record as the day that Steve danced on Church Chat, please.
Yeah. It's on the internet forever now, Steve. Anyway, what's going on in a Dilbert cartoon? 3-panel story structure. Introduce the story, deliver the joke, do a postscript, which sort of adds more to the joke. And that's what I wanted to do with this dashboard. Clearly, I'm not trying to be funny because the data set is not funny, but it's set up the story, deliver conclusions about the days, and then a little epilogue that trends maybe are going down. So that was one very deliberate design choice about the layout that I made here. But what else was going on in this dashboard? Well, back in 2014, if I'd have just built the charts and put the words in the text boxes, this is what it would have looked like. And I went from this to the view at the bottom. Any regular viewers of Chart Chat will know one of the things I love to do is kind of go, what have I actually done to get from A to B? And it's always amazing how far you get with those things. So what I've learned over the years is a sense of which design changes and which design choices are the best to implement. And what I did after building that fatalities dashboard is step back and quantify every design choice I'd made. And a quantification based on 2 measures, how difficult it was in terms of time or technical skill, and then what was the impact on the end result for the user's perspective. That delivers you 4 quadrants. In the top left, anything that's here is high impact and really easy to do. Do them. Down in the bottom right, they don't make that much of a difference and they're hard to do. Perhaps you don't want to do those. And then here are the design choices I made according to my subjective quantifications. But this became a model that I sort of, over the years, came across automatically, right? And that is really how I have continued my design journey and trying to work out which little or big decisions am I going to make in a visualization. The goal is to get the maximum user engagement with efficient use of your time. Now, if you're doing an IronViz entry or something for the Information is Beautiful awards, you are going to do the low impact and hard ones because it's really important. If you're just sending an ad hoc email on a Slack channel to some colleagues, you're probably not going to do any of those. If it's an internal email, then the choices around here might change. And really, that's where I'm going to stop and invite comments in the next sections from Steve, Jeff, and Amanda. In doing this exercise back in 2014, it really helped me think and appreciate the big difference that the little design decisions will make, and that sometimes some of them aren't really worth doing. So there you go. That's where I'll stop. Any comments from anybody? And have we got any comments from the audience?
Well, and I think that looking at this, Andy, one of the things that struck me is those numbers, even like with your illustrative add an average reference line, the difficulty level and how complex that is and how much time it takes may vary widely depending on what tool you're using or how much experience you have with a tool. The thing that is easy for Jeff Shaffer to do in Tableau may not be easy for me to do in Tableau. And so as we think about kind of what that looks like, I think it's an interesting matrix to me because it seems like a good space for collaboration across a team to say, like, what are the things we want to do and where would we place them in these quadrants? But it reminds me kind of story points estimation and agile project management. You're kind of like, I think this is a 2. You think this is an 8. Let's talk about kind of why we think that they're different in terms of what the impact is and the difficulty level. So I think it's a really interesting space, both for you as an individual, but also thinking about it as kind of a team collaboration or conversation tool if you're building enterprise dashboards.
Yeah.
Steve, Jeff?
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I've got, when I saw the scatter plot, I also, some of these things, we say the tiny, some of these things are not so tiny. Some of the, the aha, the, change you make, suddenly the viz blossoms. So.
Sorry, Steve, I'm going to steal this. I'm going to steal the share back. It's funny, isn't it? Because so the add a reference line. So this reference line here is an average. So that's the average fatalities across all the years, and then each fainter line is all the years. Yeah, is that tiny or is that not tiny? It's quite hard to implement. And is it a tiny design to the end user? It's just like, oh yeah, there's an average reference line. And this goes back to, is it Steve Jobs who said sometimes simple is hard? So, yeah, the word tiny is a subjective one.
Well, Andy, when you first showed an earlier version of that scatter plot, okay, so it had something that looked a little bit different than this. I typed into the Slack channel, hey, why didn't you color code the quadrants themselves? Why did you color code the dots? By the way, everyone, you were about to see the world that we live in and the rabbit hole that we would go down. And what would, if this were going in something like the Big Book of Dashboards, the discussions we would have about this. So I was wondering, hey, why didn't you do this? Well, I know why you didn't do it. One is it's hard in Tableau. And 2, I don't think it's going to add a whole lot of impact to this. But then the other things that we would discuss is, well, wait a second. You said definitely do those things in the upper left. Definitely don't do the things in the bottom right, but the other areas are kind of gray areas, whether you should do them. Well, why don't you color code those things gray to suggest that they're gray area? Then we would discuss, hey, is anybody else looking at this thing and going, blue and red, are the blue folks the Democrats and the red folks the Republicans? And is that going to be the immediate reaction that people have to this? So this simple, straightforward thing, we would have hours of debate as what colors we should be using, etc. But the discussion of, and Andy doesn't need the color coding, the color coding quadrants. I think this is fine, and the labeling works fine, and the point is just fine. Yeah. But in some cases, doing these background color coding can be absolutely amazing, like this thing from Roddy Zakovich, where I want to show you, had we just gone with defaults, we'd be focusing on different things. And Roddy, this is a number of years ago, where he's looking at the top 50 basketball players of all time in terms of the total points made during their careers. And in this case, I'm kind of looking at Wilt Chamberlain and Michael Jordan that are over here for whatever reason, because their average per game is much higher than everybody else. But let's see what would have happened had I just taken this data set and used the defaults. I know Jeff is going to show a great example of just using the defaults. So here's exactly the same data. Using the defaults, I'm going to put games along the bottom, and I'm going to put points, total points along the left side. And for me, at least, I'm kind of looking at, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Karl Malone. By the way, if you do not subscribe to the writings of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, you should. The guy is a brilliant social and political critic, and the stuff that he publishes and his essays are amazingly well thought out. So, well, now I want to fight the defaults a little bit. Maybe I'll color code things. Is that really helping me decode these things? And Maybe do I need the value axes to start at 0? Probably not. People have minimum of 700 games, minimum of 18,000 points. Now some things are starting to pop out. I'm not necessarily just going over here. I'm seeing Michael Jordan and Wilt Chamberlain. Maybe I have some type of reference line, which is like average points per game for everybody that's here. And I can see, hey, these have a lot more points per game, and these people have more games and fewer points. But with iterating and suggestions from colleagues, Roddy eventually came up with this technique, which I don't consider this tiny. I think the banding that's behind here is what really makes this story compelling. So Roddy's initial iteration of this used a static image behind this. This is using background images behind a scatter plot. And then the Tableau community went off to the races with this, going, wow, what a cool technique. I think this is great. I borrowed it. And this is helping these bands behind things. But Klaus Schulte got involved with Roddy and said, well, instead of a static image, can we come up with a programmatic way to automatically adjust these things? And as long as we're doing that, we can get curvy bands happening, etc. I thought this was the absolutely the Tableau and data visualization community at its best. If you want to put bands, BANDS, not BANS, that's another type of visualization component, behind your scatter plots, you can just do a Google search. How do I do this in Tableau? You will find how-to articles created by Roddy, Klaus, and others, and you will have this wonderful potent technique available to you if you need to go that extra mile with this.
It's funny, it's still tiny to the end user, because they might look at it and go, that's a really impressive chart, right? But it's very much in the hard to implement and big impact. But and the end user, they don't care how much it's been crafted, when you publish that on the website.
Well, I'd now say the initial version was hard. Now it's easy because someone has figured out the technique, written a blog post on exactly what to do, and you can just kind of copy their techniques openly. Yeah. Just make sure to do the right thing and say, a nod of credit to whomever developed the technique and helped you out.
Indeed.
Well, I think it's really interesting here around like this great question from Ray around all of these tiny, we'll put tiny in quotes, design decisions that we do kind of in a state of flow or pilot in terms of things we just go through. Like my brain kind of goes through a natural, I don't want to call it a checklist, but kind of okay, so I'm going to go ahead and declutter these things. I'm going to add in the text I want, and then I'm going to add the color back in. I tend to start in grayscale so I can add color with purpose instead of starting with color or whatever the default colors are. I forget who said it, but there was a data viz person who said, get it right in black and white first and get the shape of what you want and then add the color with meaning. And I'm curious if for the rest of you is how much of this is autopilot at this point and what did it take for you to get there?
It's a great question, Ray. It's definitely largely autopilot. There's autopilot to a point, I think. And then towards the end, I'll start thinking about the audience and the end factor. But a lot of this, as you saw my evolution over time, a lot of this is now autopilot. But it doesn't mean it's always the same path. That's important.
To me, I'm constantly assembling or curating wonderful examples that other people have come up with. I've now seen these banding technique behind a scatter plot, and that's now in my vocabulary of possible stuff. So the more you do this, the more things you see, the more examples where you go, that's really good. You have a greater collection of things to fall back on and try.
Jeff?
I would say lots of things that are automatic, like you build a dashboard and I don't even think about it anymore. Right click on a map or right click on a bar chart, remove the borders, add the lines, fix the access. It's like all those things are you're just used to doing it 100 times a day. And so every time you do it, you're like, okay, I'm done. Now I got to do this, and this. And you don't even think about it. Yeah.
Well, and you had that list, Andy, on your slides that kind of had like the axes, the grid lines, the sizing, the this, that, and the other that you all go ahead and put together in order to get to a place of here are the things that we do. And I do think there's a value to the language there, especially if you're working with new learners. When I'm working with folks who are newer in data visualizations, actually articulating and going through that list step by step and talking about what those things are also helps them find them in their respective tools. And I mean, in Excel, you can declutter down a bar chart and save that as a template. That's your kind of default bar chart in Excel, for example. So I think that having that kind of shared language is so helpful, especially when we're working with people who are, to your point, Andy, someone is at that early stage of their data viz journey. And how can we be supportive and enabling and helping them along as they learn and they grow, and it turns into defaults for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jeff, I know you had some examples to demo through for us in terms of some of those changes. And I know I will just flag that Greg thinks that maybe the banding was actually more effective if you just colored the data points. We did debate that, Greg, in terms of do you need the bands or not. So it's always great to hear that people have different takes on what would be effective or not and looking at the color coding. Let's go ahead and pivot over to Jeff, though. Do you want to go ahead and share a couple of your examples that you had in terms of looking at different things?
Yeah, I'm
You're gonna call me out of my Twitter follower counts, Jeff? Come on.
I'm gonna demonstrate some stuff in a tool, and doing a tool live demo is always a bad idea, right? So I'm gonna use Excel and Tableau live on YouTube. That this is not gonna bode well, I'm sure. But
we're all excited, Jeff.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to go in a different direction of thinking about like what happens when you use program defaults. And I started thinking about this a long time ago when I was teaching my class at UC. And I have this Halloween data set. And if you've not followed, I track my Halloween people at Halloween. And it's really a simple data set, right? You think about, okay, I'm just tracking like what year was Halloween. It's always on October 31st, or it has been. And so there's just a year, and then there's a time, and then there's how many people have come for trick-or-treating to get candy on that date. And then there's 4 years of data at this point in time, and I'm teaching this class at UC, and my students are turning these things in. And like you might think when you look at this, like, are they cheating off of each other, right? Like, is everybody just like cheating? They're all getting together in a room to create a visualization, because when you put it in Excel, you'd get person A, and then you'd get person B, and then you'd get person C, and then you'd get person D, and like the colors are the same and the markers are the same and everything's the same about it, right? And then you quickly realize it's like, no, they're not cheating off of each other. I don't know why that student called that a scatter plot, but first day of class. Anyway, what you really realize is that they're not cheating. They're using software defaults. It's somebody who's not familiar with the tool. And so let me show you some things that we take for granted. We're like, oh, your bar chart, for example, it always needs to start at 0. And why do people not, do that? Well, let me just show you something. I don't know if anybody knows, this in Excel, but we're going to go insert and just look at our Twitter followers. And oh, by the way, we all know that Excel will do a wonderful job of creating 3D charts for us, right? With a click of a button, we can get a really terrible chart. But if we choose the right one, we have this chart, and now we have this bar chart, and everything looks good. And then after chart chat today, everybody doesn't like Jeff's presentation, so he's going to lose 16,000 followers. And so he's down to 20. Everybody really likes Steve's presentation, so he's up to 19,000 followers. And then all of a sudden, Amanda, she does really great, and she's going to do 19.5. Let's see. Now, pay attention to this chart over here on the right that starts at 0. All of a sudden, just the data changed. What's Excel going to do to my chart? Well, now Excel all of a sudden doesn't start my chart at 0. All of a sudden, Excel is starting my chart at 17,500. Like, why does that happen? Well, Excel has this rule built into it that people don't think about. It's like the 5/6 rule. Well, if something crosses 83.333% of the top value, well, what is that? Let's just take equals the top value times 0.8333, right? And that's 1666, right? So if Amanda is at 166665, hey, it'll start at 0. But if she gets 2 more Twitter followers and it goes to 7, all of a sudden that access doesn't start at 0, right? Like that 5/6 rule, for whatever reason, is built into Excel, and now your chart is not doing what you're doing. And is somebody really going to pay attention to that and understand that based on their data and see it? I'm not so sure. Let's look at another one. We'll go over here, and we have this data that is my Halloween. And this is how I recorded the Halloween data. And I take that data and I just say, you know what? I want to go see a line chart. So I go in here and I use the chart generator. And all of a sudden, I have this series for year that isn't part of my data. I'm plotting the number of trick-or-treaters as if it's 2,000 trick-or-treaters and 2001 trick-or-treaters. And so then you're like, well, wait a minute. Why does that happen? Well, if Excel didn't have that word year here, what would happen if I plotted that same data and just click the line chart, insert up here, and I go to line chart and I insert the line chart? Well, then it doesn't plot the series. But then you look at yourself, well, wait a minute, year's going backwards. Year time series is going backwards. Well, then we'd be, the data viz community go, well, time series really should go this way forward. Well, you'd have to know to be able to go into the axis and click the axis and reverse the axis. What would happen? Think about this. If all the data weren't here, if you had a date and you had 1031 and you got rid of the word date, okay, well, then maybe it would plot it differently. Maybe Excel would plot it as time series data. Well, yes, it does. But then look at your label. Now it's in date order and everything's good because you put a date in the field, but now it's the first of every month. And so you have the first of every month over and over again. And by the way, it doesn't fit. So it's now 45-degree text. So now you have to fix that. And so all of a sudden Excel did that to you. And then I love this one. Your rows or columns matter. What if you only have 4 or 5? Let's just delete these. Count the ones across. I have 7 columns. I have 4 rows. Well, because my columns are more than my rows or my rows are more than my columns, well, then when I plot the line chart, it'll do the series differently and it'll put the years on there and my time is now in there. And that, when there's 4 years of data or 5 years of data, is the default chart that all of my students are turning in. Remember, that's the Excel default version, right? That everybody creates in Excel, because that is what they highlight and they click insert, and that's the chart that comes. And then you say, okay, well, what about the time format? What if you looked at, the time format up here? Well, that would be different. That would create something different. Then jump over to Tableau. Well, Tableau likes its data tall, not wide. So if you're going to put this in Tableau, if you were to put this in a wide format, you'd get a field for 6 o'clock and a field for 6:30 and a field for 7:30. Well, that would be terrible. You wouldn't want to do that. So then you say, okay, well, I'm going to take this data and I'm going to put this data in Tableau. So let's go over to Tableau and see what Tableau does by default. Here's a Tableau workbook. I'll paste the data into Tableau. Tableau doesn't make some of these bad charting decisions for us, but it really does something different. So let's just start from scratch here. If I put date and time, it's going to take the year of the date and time. If I put the count on here, all of a sudden I have a different view of the count. My year is in order, but how would I go about creating this chart? Let's talk about this one. How would I create that chart that is instant with 2 clicks in Tableau with 4 or 5 years of data that every student created? Would somebody really do that in Tableau? I'm not so sure. Well, here's what you would have to do in Tableau to get this chart. You'll love this. Ask Andy Kriebel what he thinks about time in Tableau. You can't do time well in Tableau. So if I put date and time up here, I have a date and a time. Okay, well, let's use exact date. Well, okay, now I have exact date, and then I use my count and put my count on here, and then I get this. How would I just show 6 p.m. or 7 p.m.? Well, to do that, you're going to love this. I have to create a field for the hour of the data. So now I have the hour of the data. Then I have to repeat and create a minute of the data, repeat and create a second of the data. And then once I do that, I have to create a dummy for that data and create a make time of that data. Is somebody starting out in Tableau going to know how to do that formula to create that? Okay, then once you have all that done, you create your dummy date. Let's put our dummy date up here. We'll use our exact dummy date. And then we'll put our count up here. And then I have it. Then I have to create a quick table calculation for a running total. And then I have to put my year on color to get that chart. Would you really be able to do that? I mean, in Excel, 2 clicks, default chart, every student creates it. In Tableau, my default chart's something completely different. My shape of my data is different. My format of my columns are different. And I'd have to go through 6 or 7 different field calculations and a table calculation to get to that same thing. And so that's really interesting to me, is that I think we take for granted what our tool does. Now I can go in here and think about this. Okay, here's the 4 years of data that is that first chart. Here's those little design decisions. Now I got to go clean up my x-axis. It has to start at 6 o'clock. And so I have to go in here and set it for 6 o'clock. And, am I really going to do that? And then put it in 15-minute increments and do that and set my tick mark so that I can do that. And by the way, I clicked AM, right? So I messed that up. So all these little things that I just don't know that somebody's going to do out of the gate is it's just a really interesting topic to me. Is our tool drives our chart decisions and our chart choices, and especially young users who are just starting out. They would not create this chart in Tableau. I'd never see that. They wouldn't show me any visualization of the data, which then kind of leads to our next discussion, which is, are you better just drawing it on paper and then trying to figure out how to do it in your tool?
There we go. Applause for Jeff on the number.
Yeah,
of
Jeff,
table
I don't think you're going to
tools.
lose any followers.
The, I will say that 83.33% number just makes me wonder about how these numbers come into Microsoft. It's like the 182% default gap width between bars on bar charts that I always go and customize in. And I say to people I'm working with, you know, if you're going to make one change in Excel on your bar charts, please make the gap width so that the width between the bars is narrower than the bars themselves. So I think it's really interesting. And I love this in terms of Nina just saying, like, as a Tableau newbie, I'm loving this topic, because I think that oftentimes the sales pitch from any data viz tool, I won't single out Tableau on this, is with a few simple clicks, you can have elegant, beautiful, interactive dashboards. And it is not necessarily the case that the things that you see and that you're seeing modeled are the things that are simple and easy to do. And how those things get done depends a lot on the different tools that you're using. I know Galen had flagged that for him, like the pivoting back and forth between Power BI and Tableau, for example, and going back and forth with what's easy in one place is nearly impossible in another, is something we deal with across a lot of different tools. Andy, Steve?
I was just going to say, on behalf of everybody else who was thinking it, Jeff, how do you have so many people coming to your trick or treat? Or perhaps it's just me as a Brit that think that those numbers are amazing.
My most trick or treaters is 869. Yes, that's crazy.
Well, Jeff doesn't give away candy. He gives away $10 and $20 bills. And
yeah, Americans, you do Halloween properly in America, so that's good. I get about 10 people if I'm lucky in my village.
It's an interesting question on the paper, though. Like Ray made the point that sometimes you can come up with things on paper that you never really iterate to if you were working in a tool, because you just wouldn't get there natively. And then you think about the geometry and the math and the numbers that would go into creating it. It makes me think of kind of the organization of a tool like Tableau around a grammar of graphics framework versus something like Excel, where you're clicking through different chart types. In terms of thinking about what that looks like and how people approach this, I know, Andy, you were not a fan of starting on paper, if I remember. Jumping forward to our lightning round.
Yeah, I'm gonna. Yeah, shall I dive into that now? Sure. Yeah. So, all right. Sketch on paper before you go into a tool. You're getting some people who love that, and you know, I'm just going to provoke you all and share a retweet of a tweet from a week or so ago. So Ben Larson said, the truth, here's a box plot that you see in school, isn't it pretty? And here's a box plot as it appears in real life, it's garbage. And my tweet was saying, this is why I don't recommend starting on paper. Now, why do I not recommend starting in paper? It's a personal story of pain. About 10 years ago, when I was quite new at Tableau, I was sent to the Netherlands, where Jan Tulp, the legend data viz designer, had sat with this client, and they prototyped on paper a dashboard for the organization. And my job as a young Tableau pre-sales engineer was, they've had this data viz superhero design a dashboard, implement it in Tableau. I arrived on site. Julie looked at the design, thought that's pretty good. It's got all the things in the right places, implemented the dashboard, and it looked like garbage because Jan had drawn nice line charts that slope up and a bar chart with a nice distribution of bars and data. But of course, the reality of this client's data was complete outliers and completely skewed data points, and it just didn't work. The client was really frustrated. It was like, well, Tableau's useless, isn't it? And at that point, I was like, well, no, you started with the idealized version of a dashboard on a piece of paper. You weren't led by the data. So I think you should get into the data right away. And I'm going to hold myself back from saying, but really it depends. I'm just going to say, start with the data and bring it on. And what do you all think?
What if you don't have it? How much time would you invest in building a big dummy data set, Andy, in order to enable prototyping?
I'm not saying my argument can't be picked apart very easily. Good point.
I think my view on this, I guess, is it does depend, and I've done both, right? So when you see a data set and you're trying to explore it, I do find myself in Tableau. Now, granted, I feel like I'm comfortable in Tableau where I can iterate and create lots of different views of the data, which then bring me down the path of exploring. At the same time, sometimes you have a user requirement, right, where they need to see certain information. And I can think of a dashboard at work just recently. Somebody created a dashboard for themselves, then they presented it to a team, and I had some ideas on improving it. And Kevin and I were talking about it. And, Kevin, I think would have his own ideas. I would have my own ideas. That would be you can't collaborate in Tableau anyway, not very well, right? You can't get on there and you'd have to get in a room and one person would have to do it. That's where going up to a whiteboard and saying, well, maybe this would work or maybe that would work. And I could see sketching something on a whiteboard or a piece of paper can be really helpful in those instances when you're trying to figure out ideas.
I don't see how you can do this without having some sense of what the data is. Now, almost to a T, 99% of people who attend my dashboard design workshop, when I give them assignments to do and say, how would you visualize this data? And sometimes they have to work in teams. The teams or the individual that tries to do it in just 5 minutes using a tool usually fails miserably because they don't know the tool well enough for it to do the bidding for them. The people who sketch it out quickly usually get some stuff that looks great. I'm not saying that's what should work for you. I saw Kevin Flairler saying, oh no, he loves just using the tool. Amongst the very best who ever used Tableau, Kelly Martin said her sketch tool, what she uses to sketch is Tableau. That's her canvas. That's where she practices stuff. That's where she figures out her ideas. But you have to have enough familiarity and dexterity with the tool to be able to do that. A lot of people don't. They're better with a piece of paper and a writing implement such as this one. So yes, it depends. I'm not going to force people to do it one way. I will encourage them to try just sketching this on a little piece of paper, see what you come up with.
I found that one of the biggest limitations really is that question around availability of the big data sets and what it looks like. And if we know the questions that our users want to answer and have a sense historically of what the patterns have looked like, so you're not flying totally blind, that if I was to wait till we had all the data engineering work to have my data source set up, to go ahead and start working on a dashboard, I lose my opportunity for the prototyping pieces and for showing something to someone, getting feedback and iterating on it. And even if the charts aren't perfect, it at least gives me a sense of balance. How much space do different kinds of charts need to take up in terms of the question we're answering, and in terms of some of the pieces around language and what we can remove. And so I found that paper prototyping piece, whiteboarding things, is really valuable because it also gets you to kind of that MVP kind of piece first, the minimum viable product idea. It gets you there faster. And your clients don't feel like you went behind a brick wall for 4 weeks when most of that was data engineering and query development time, figuring things out only to see something that they have lots of ideas on how they'd like to change. And so my biggest failure story from that, Andy, was when I assumed I could do things in Power BI that I couldn't very easily in a production environment. You could hack it and make it work. That I could do in Tableau, pointing specifically here at dot strip plots, which you'd think would be inbuilt in any dashboarding and data viz tool, and prototyped a whole series of dashboards using Power. That was going to be our first set in Power BI with a bunch of dot strip plots that then were a beast to figure out how to do with some embedded additional extensions. So learned my lesson there on, if you know what the tool you have to work with is, know its limitations before you start showing paper prototypes to your clients.
Hey, I'm going to put that was one of the stories in Nightingale, which the first print edition, not one, but so one of the horror stories in Nightingale was along those lines as well. By the way, congratulations on your first issue of Nightingale. It is exceptional.
Yes, very exciting.
I think you brought up a point, Amanda, on the data. I've been, I've consulted in organizations where they lock down the data, right? And so you have to put in a request for exactly the data you need. And it's like, well, how do I know what data I need? I haven't even looked at the data, so I don't even know the pattern in the data. And so, in an organization where Kevin is, he likes working in Tableau. Well, he has access to all the data. He can go pull anything from any table that he wants to, and he can explore all he wants to find those stories in the data. But if he were working at a big bank that locked down that data and he was, doing something in a particular silo, well, then you'd have to pull a data request, right? And you'd have to go, well, I need this field or I need that field. And, that's a completely different requirement, completely different design process.
Yep.
Yep. I just find myself going back to the 5/6 decision. Who made that decision and when? Someone in here said, some legacy, if this goes back to Excel 3.0 or something from 1992 or something like that. And, someone made this decision. I don't know. It seemed like a good idea to do this, to adjust the bars. It's been there ever since, and it has tripped up well-meaning people ever since then. Yep. Thank you.
It's a slightly different one, actually, but it's that's going to bug you for weeks. That is, Steve. I know you well enough that you're going to still be talking about.
I know some of the developers of those early versions. I'm going to find out who did this, what made it, and would the fabric of modern civilization crumble if they were to change this? Is everything? No, the entire product would collapse. It's so embedded deep in the code that you can't make that change.
So I think we could probably wax poetically around all of our failure stories and also the ways in which tools drive decisions or not. But given that we've got a few minutes to wrap up, let's go ahead and tackle our other lightning round topic. Steve, we were just having a wonderful little chat about Boris Johnson and his pseudo resignation, I suppose. I'm using the wrong language there.
Andy, I'd love for you to enlighten us. But the discussion of index charts and these business type things that keep coming into mainstream media for various reasons. So the index chart, we discussed them in the big book of dashboards, also in the big picture. Jeff has a wonderful example where he's comparing how long did it take to get 1 billion views on YouTube, where he compares Hello from Adele with Gangnam Style from Psy. But the idea is something like this. We want to say, hey, how is this quarter doing at this point compared to a year ago, compared to last quarter? So I've got all this data here, which has, here's the current quarter, the previous quarter, and here's a year ago, the same quarter. And maybe I'll do the running sum of these things, but which one is getting higher faster? Well, they're all starting at different times. The conceit of the index chart is, imagine instead of them starting on the date, they all started on the same date, or in this case, the first week of the quarter, the second week of the quarter, the first week of whatever quarter. So we can take this item here and kind of move it over here, and then we can focus on the, hey, look how, we're not done yet. We're only, 10 weeks into this quarter, but look how much higher we're doing than a year ago. And that's the idea behind this. Well, and how it's manifested itself in the big book of dashboards and in the big picture. It's a great way to show this type of data. Well, we saw it ad nauseum from John Byrne Murdoch and many other people when we started looking at, oh my gosh, how is the country I'm in doing compared to other countries? They had their outbreak way before we did. So number of days since 100 total cases first recorded. I can't believe that is the benchmark at the time, 100 cases. By the way, we'll save, this log scale for, we've already discussed it ad nauseum at times. But guess what? This wonderful, hey, imagine all these things starting at the same time, from our friend at The Economist, Alex Selby Boothroyd. All these different publications comparing the different prime ministers of England and how long it took to get this many resignations. So here we have clearly the Financial Times, because it has, they call that color pink. I call it sort of a beige behind there. And oh my gosh, look how much faster it's taken this many people to resign in Johnson than in any other administration. Oh, here we go. Obviously, The Economist, that's here. Here are a couple of other organizations that I am not familiar with, all taking the same data set, all coming up with this wonderful stepped way to show Boris Johnson clearly winning in an ignominious way in this case. And these examples here, and maybe the best one that we saw of the bunch was this one, which is the needlepoint version of this thing. Although Alex said, I'm clearly getting stressed out because it's way harder to increase the value axes on something which is chiseled in stone or created with needlepoint here. So wonderful seeing the index chart come into mainstream publication again, although for a pretty horrible reason, Andy. So
indeed, I mean, I wish you'd taken a timestamp of each of the different examples, because that, you know, the guy from Institute for Government was updating the axis. I mean, the ministers in the government were falling by the hour. It was an astonishing 2 days to be listening to the radio. As you know, the news was changing second by second.
I think there was a lost opportunity. Did anybody take the step line chart and reverse the axis and put the title on it, Stepping Down?
It would have been there. Damn, if only we'd been there to iterate with the
Jeff
designers.
always comes in with these visual metaphors that work out so nicely in terms of where your strengths are, I feel like. So we'll go ahead and wrap up chart chat. And Andy, I'm sorry, there are opportunities for these kind of step down charts, but great to go ahead and focus on that and see our favorite index charts popping up one more time. We'll go ahead and wrap up chart chat 32 today. This is our 32nd edition. Remember, you would not see number 30 in the playlist. We did have someone ask us about that because it was live at Tableau, and big thanks to my co-hosts for having carried the mantle of that while they were there in person and delivering a great session. So as we go ahead and wrap up, a reminder that our next Chart Chat Live is going to be in September, not October, number 33. So come check us out and join us in September. Watch for some announcements about the topic and potential guests. So very excited about that. We saw a great idea maybe in the chat box that if you have suggestions on things we should talk about at Chart Chat, we always love to hear about that. As someone mentioned, maybe talking about tools, and we can have a battle of the tools of sorts that would go ahead and talk about the different ways in which different tools do different things well or not. So always feel free to go ahead and suggest topics that you would love to hear us debate and talk about and see what that looks like. Big Book of Dashboards, you can always find resources on their website for workshops, recordings, and resources. Steve, you have slides that I failed to go ahead and have actually load properly, but you've got a workshop coming up, right?
I do. Just go to bigbookofdashboards.com or datarevelations.com, and I've got a dashboard design workshop on July 20th and 21st of next week, and there are still a couple of slots open, so we'd love to have people join.
Awesome. And then Data Visualization Society, as always, love to see people over in our Slack and hanging out with us on social media and other spaces. Come hang out and check out Nightingale in print. If you order Nightingale in print, you can still order a copy of issue 1. We're in our second reprint, which is exciting and cool. But there is a really cool print magazine, but also this cool kids table insert. So if you want to go ahead and do cool data viz stuff with your children or just, yourself on the topic of sketching, we think it's pretty cool. So lots of good things happening there, and watch for some exciting announcements about the IIB Awards coming up over the course of the next month. So excited about that. And join the after party. As you know, we have our infamous now after party, where you can go ahead and you can join the conversation yourself. You'll see a link down below over in the comments if you want to check it out. Also, go ahead and just go to bigpic.me/cc32after. And with that, we will wrap up one more brilliant and very vibrant chart chat. Thanks to all of my co-hosts for their time and for doing an exceptional job at walking through a lot of these seemingly tiny design decisions. We hope we'll see you at the after party. Unfortunately, I'm going to miss the after party today, but I'm sure you'll be in great hands with Andy, Jeff, and Steve. With that, we'll go ahead and we will sign off for the day. We'll see you over in that Zoom link if you want to join us there. And with that, we'll see you hopefully in September.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.